All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name's Hallie. I'm a member of the Juris Education team. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on steps for LSAT success. We have a couple of our Juris Education consultants here with us today who are going to walk us through this topic. We'll go over our agenda in just a second. For those that don't know, Juris Education is an admissions consulting company, and we work with students who are interested in applying to law school through the entire application process, from just starting to think about law school applications in early college and preparing their resume for that, through studying for the LSAT, taking the LSAT, filling out your applications, and everything that happens between deciding you want to apply and going to law school. So today, talking about the LSAT, I'll have our consultants introduce themselves and give us a little background on how they've come to work with Juris. We'll talk about just a base overview of the LSAT. We'll go a little bit more in depth into what is involved. We'll talk about registering for it. We'll talk about common mistakes you want to avoid. We'll go over some tips to help you ace it, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A. So if you have questions, pop those in the Q&A box and we will get to those at the end. Additionally, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sending it out via email over the next few days, so you have access to all the information that we cover here as well. Before we dive in, Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here with you all today. My name is Stephen. I'm originally from Houston, and I am a third-year law student at Harvard. In my time studying for the LSAT, there was many different hurdles I had to overcome, and I actually ended up taking the LSAT a couple of times. So it wasn't, the easiest process for me, but through my time, I've certainly learned a lot and was able to get the result that I ultimately wanted. So happy to discuss some tips and tricks with you all today on the LSAT.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. Excited to have you. And Mark, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Mark, and I graduated from Duke University School of Law in 2021. I then went on to sit for the Washington, D.C. bar and worked at an international law firm in Washington, D.C. for about a year and a half, until I transitioned into both being an admissions consultant for Juris Education as well as doing some other risk management consulting. The LSAT isn't the easiest test you'll ever take, but it's definitely learnable. And if you put in the time and the effort, it's something you can definitely do well on.
Awesome. All right, well, let's dive in and talk about understanding the LSAT. Let's go over some of the basics. Stephen, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So what is the LSAT? The LSAT is obviously a standardized examination that is essentially used by law schools as a measure to capture student performance in kind of a uniform test. It allows law schools to kind of realize students' analytical abilities, as well as their ability to read through course material in a quick manner and kind of see some potential skills that would be used in law school.
Yeah, the LSAT can really, it may seem like a scary thing to do or something that you could be worried about hurting your application, but it also serves as a way for just schools to level the playing field and evaluate everyone objectively over the same metrics, because as we all know, GPAs across majors and across schools aren't always equal, because some classes are harder than others, and the LSAT really allows schools to look at everyone objectively in the same way. And moving on to the general format and structure of the LSAT, currently there are three main subjects that are being tested. Those are logical reasoning, reading comprehension, and analytical reasoning. Logical reasoning, currently you will have one graded section of this. In August 2024, there will be a second section added. We'll get into that a little bit later, but this consists of between 24 and 26 small multiple choice questions for each section, which they'll give you a short prompt of between like 1 to 3 sentences, and then they will ask you to logically analyze the question in a very, very quick question they give you. Then the reading comprehension can sort of be looked at as like a long form logical reasoning exercise where they'll give you a series of different passages, usually between 2 and 4 per section. And then these passages will range from a few paragraphs to about a page. And then you'll be asked a series of questions about the content that was delivered in that passage. The third section is called analytical reasoning officially, but you might know it better as the unofficial name of logic games. This section will give you 4 different games of varying different types. You may have some experience with this. It's sort of the weirdest section of the LSAT, but in my opinion, one of the most learnable. As you see on the screen, they're removing this section starting in August of 2024. However, the administrations both in January, in March, and then next summer will still have this. So if you're planning to apply next cycle, you may want to consider actually taking the LSAT before they remove this section, because as I mentioned, it's a strange section, but it's also one of the most learnable if you really drill down and just take as many games as possible and go through and completely analyzing them. So that's something to consider. You may want to actually take this section if that could become one of your stronger ones. In addition to these 3, there will be 1 variable unscored experimental section that is really just testing future questions that will be included in future administrations of the LSAT to make sure that they are all valid questions. And this will be another 35-minute section. There will also be a writing sample that you will be expected to provide. And this has now been transferred to the online LSAT writing, which you can take. I think they give you about 8 days before the administration to get into it, which is nice now that you can take the LSAT writing ahead of the actual administration.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. That was pretty comprehensive, Mark.
Thanks.
All right. And so we don't need to go in depth on this slide, but here's some upcoming test dates through next summer and the registration deadlines. Do either of you have any tips on making sure you get the test dates that you want registering? Anything along those lines?
My only advice would be register as soon as possible. As soon as you know you are going to take a particular administration, go ahead and register so that there are no problems with it. Also, one thing to consider when registering for a future test, if you have outstanding applications with schools and they see a pending test in the future, they won't look at your application until that pending score comes in.
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful information, Mark, as well. One thing I would add to that is there's also throughout the year, past June and into November, there's tests as well. I don't think that's necessarily captured on this slide, but there's more tests as well that are available for students. And a part of your LSAT, practice, I think you should be mindful about when you want to select a date when you're best prepared and able to take the test is my general advice. But also make sure that you keep this information in mind when these registration deadlines occur. You really want to make sure that you can sit for the test that is best for you.
Great. Right, so let's dive a little bit deeper into the LSAT.
Yeah, so as Mark discussed earlier, the LSAT is broken down into 3 main sections. When you have the logical reasoning, which is your logic games, logical reasoning is not your logic games. That's analytical reasoning. But you have your 3 sections, and they're divided to capture different skills. Mark, do you want to say more about the, kind of structure of these different sections?
Yeah. Like I said earlier, the logical reasoning is sort of like a short form of the reading comprehension, and the reading comprehension is sort of a long form of the logical reasoning with some differences. And then again, the logic games, they'll give you sort of I like to think of them as like sorting exercises, or at least the majority of them are. There are many different types of logic games that they'll test, and they're getting more creative in recent years. I've looked at some of the more recent test questions since I took it, and it just seems to be getting more complex, but that is going away eventually.
I guess we could go to the next slide.
All right.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, there will also be what is called a variable or a test section of the LSAT. This will either be a reading comprehension section, a logical reasoning section, or a logic game section where the tests, it won't count towards your score. They're testing future questions for future administrations. Some of these questions will go through multiple rounds and may determine that they're invalid in the end. However, you really can't tell which section is the variable section. You should treat every section as if it's official and as if it counts. For example, on my administration, I had 2 logic game sections, so that meant one of them was experimental. One of the sections seemed very strange to me, and so I had in the back of my head, oh, this must be the experimental section. I still took it seriously, and then it turned out it was the opposite when I finally got my results. So you might think you can tell, you never really can with the experimental section. And then the LSAT writing sample is not super critical for your application. Schools mainly just want to see that you can make a coherent argument, because what they'll do is they'll give you some sort of a real life case or some sort of a controversy, and then they'll ask you to write about which side you think is right. And as long as you put together like a coherent argument, you make sense, you're not just drawing a picture on your screen, this should usually be good to go.
Certainly. And what I would add to the variable section piece is all your focus on test day should just be on, getting every answer you can correct, and not necessarily predicting which format of what the test may be, because you could get surprised and that can really bite you. So it's important to just, take everything as serious as possible and focus your energy on just getting the answer correct. And then the writing sample, Mark, you're absolutely right. I think, law schools, to the extent they look at this, I think they just want to see that you can, articulate a clear, concise argument. It doesn't necessarily have to be, this long drawn out thesis. I think it's just, formulating ideas in a coherent manner. I think I wrote maybe 2 paragraphs. I was very, very concise. Maybe too concise, but I don't think that it's necessarily something that should be, stressed on too heavily in the course of this whole process, the writing sample.
Yeah, I would say maybe do 1 practice timed writing sample and then call it a day. I wouldn't spend hours upon hours on that section. Yeah,
I think one thing I did that was pretty helpful is like I just watched like a 20-minute instructional YouTube video.
We probably watched the same video. I think.
Yeah, and it was all that I needed. Like I spent like maybe an hour on prep for writing sample, which obviously in comparison to the LSAT as a whole was, minute. So
hopefully that's reassuring for some people joining us today. All right, let's talk about scoring.
I can talk about this one briefly. Mark, you can follow up if I miss anything. So the LSAT is based on a scale from 120, which is the lowest number you can get, or score you can get, to 180. The score ranges scale upwards. So, the distance between a 180 and a 177 is pretty small in terms of, answer choice correctness.
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to, 120 to 123. We could talk a little bit more about that a little later on. But, all questions do carry equal weight. So that's, something that you should really, keep in mind as, throughout, as you're taking the test. The logical reasoning question in front of you is the same, as the, analytical reasoning question before you, or reading comp question before you. So, making sure that you're strong and prepared for each section is vital for optimizing your score. So, really investing time in each section as you prepare for the exam, is important, obviously, as you navigate this process.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is really stress that there's no penalty for incorrect answers. It's not like some tests that do penalize you for that. So make sure that you answer every single question on the test, even if it's a blind answer. What I would do is I would make sure I baked into my timing strategies about a minute to just go through the bubble sheet and make sure everything's bubbled in. If you're taking it online, just maybe you don't even need a full minute, but make sure you answer everything, because you're really leaving points on the table if you're just leaving answers blank. At least have a guess.
Yeah, I mean, the LSAT does not care if you have no idea whether it's a guess or you have full certainty as to whether you picked the correct answer. It's still a point at the end of the day, and obviously you want all the points you can get.
Great. So let's briefly talk about registering for the LSAT.
All right, so registering for the LSAT is a pretty easy process. The first thing you're going to have to do is create an account with LSAC. If you're not familiar with LSAC, that is, I believe it stands for the Law School Admissions Council. That's just off of the top of my head, so don't take me on my word for that. But LSAC is really sort of the clearinghouse for all of your application materials. For the vast majority of law schools, their applications are going to be on the LSAC website. You'll have your recommenders send your letters of recommendation to LSAC, and then they'll put that into your account. So you really need an LSAC account to do anything. And the first thing you really should be doing is getting set up for the LSAT. Once you get in there, you will choose a test date. I believe the only one open right now is the January date, which closes tomorrow. So if you're planning to apply for this admission cycle, for admissions next fall, strongly encourage that you're signed up for January at least. Then you just fill out the form, very basic stuff, pay the registration fee, and then you can flag whether you need any sort of accommodations, which we can talk a little bit more about, and then you'll receive a confirmation of your seat. And then a little bit later, they'll open up a scheduling window where you can go in, and new this year, you can take the LSAT proctored at home. There are some pitfalls about that we can talk about a little bit later. And then they also still have the traditional in-person tests for now, at least.
Yep. So the LSAT offers accommodations for test takers with disabilities. So if you have a disability that may lead you to need more time on the test day, all you need to do is submit a request, which on LSAC you can find more information about how to do so. All you need is supporting documentation along with meeting that accommodation request deadline. It takes some time for LSAC to process this information before your desired test date, and the LSAT will actually, if this information, if you provide the right information, the LSAT can give you more time on the test for you, to take it on that day. So, Mark, do you have anything else to add on that?
The only thing I would add is that this can be quite broad for LSAC. So if you think you might qualify for this, I would definitely go down that route and see if you can get some accommodations, because you might be surprised by what qualifies.
Great. All right. Common mistakes to avoid.
Yeah, this is the fun one. Probably the number one Number one mistake to avoid is not managing your time effectively. You really don't want, you want to go into the LSAT with a plan of attack. You want to have some idea in your head of how much time you should be spending on each question. And that's not to say that the time should be even for every single question, because some are easier than others. Some you'll be able to answer in like 10 seconds. Some might take a minute or longer, depending on the section, depending on the question. So if you end up stuck on a question, make a preliminary answer, maybe circle it to go back to it, which kind of contradicts point number 2, which is skipping questions, which you shouldn't do unless in your prep and in your strategy, you've gotten down your timing so that you can complete the section with time and have time to go back and revisit some questions. Now, you should never completely skip a question in the sense that you should never not give an answer. But if you do have to come back to it later and you can bake those strategies in, it's okay to go back and revisit. However, in the beginning of your prep, you should take it one by one and make sure you have answers for everything. And again, it goes into pitfall number 3, which is just sitting and spending 5-10 minutes on a single question. If you don't know the answer, just put something in, move on. If you have time at the end to go back, great. If not, at least you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting points on that question. Number 4, I think we touched on this a little bit, is ignoring the variable section. Don't try to just figure out, oh, this is the variable section. It looks a little weird. That means I can take a 35-minute nap. Don't do that. You really, really can't tell at all. Again, number 5, not reviewing your work. And this is probably a bigger pitfall in your study than it is really on test day. Because test day, you may not have that much time. But when you're studying and you take a practice test and say you get 5, 10, 15 wrong, however many it is, in a particular section, don't just say, oh, I need to study this section more. Go back, look at all of the answers, and figure out why 3 of the answers are objectively incorrect and 1 is objectively correct. There are no questions with multiple right answers. And some of them trick you and try to make you think that there are. But if you really dig into it, really review your work in your practice, you can see that there are some very subtle differences in some of the answers and that they are all different. And then number 6 is just not familiarizing yourself with the LSAT question types. Don't go in without knowing what they're going to ask.
Yeah, if I could just add to each one briefly, Mark, you're absolutely right. I think with number 1, not managing your time effectively, I think efficiency is key on LSAT. On the LSAT, you need to go on test day thinking, how can I optimize the amount of time that I have with trying to get the most amount of certainty, the most reasonable amount of certainty per the time that I spend for each question type. And then skipping questions, you shouldn't skip questions on test day unless you've practiced that. If you shouldn't, pull that out on test day and, try to skip questions and come back to it. I think, that's something that you need to, try to incorporate in your testing practice. If, you want to kind of employ that strategy, or if you think that strategy may be useful for you. And then, focusing on a single question too much or for too long, obviously that goes back into not being efficient with your time. You need to kind of optimize, again, the amount of time you spend per the amount of certainty you try to get in as quick as amount of time as you can. And then, ignoring the variable section, I think we touched on that enough. But and then 5, not reviewing your work. Again, this is the way that you grow. Really trying to identify pitfalls that are consistent is a way that you're going to grow. You're not going to necessarily, you don't want to stagnate. And I think a lot about growth is kind of identifying where, what type of question types I'm missing, and not, perhaps it could be that you're, not necessarily, your strategy for each question type is not, optimal, which we could talk about going forward. So those are some of the things that I would add in terms of common mistakes to avoid.
Great, thank you. I see questions coming in, and just want to say we will definitely get to those at the end. We have a couple more slides to get through, but as you have questions, keep popping those in. We won't forget about them. All right, so let's talk about some expert tips to help you ace the LSAT.
Yeah, I can start. So I think obviously you want to give yourself enough time to really grasp, as much as the test as you can, and really familiarize yourself with not only all the sections, but all the question types that each section prompts. So giving yourself enough time. Some people it's 3 months. For most people, I think it's like four months. Some people even 5 months. Some people even longer. I think I was around 6 months. I took the test again in my time, but so for each person is different. But you want to make sure you give yourself as much time as you reasonably can. Obviously, there are some social constraints that may exist, but the LSAT is a pretty substantial test in terms of subject matter, and it takes us some time to really kind of hit that growth plane that you would like to kind of experience. So, and then practice regularly. I mean, this goes back to kind of growth. You want to make sure that you're really hitting home and a lot of these strategies and making them kind of second nature, so that on test day you're not kind of fumbling different strategies for different question types that may come about. You want to make sure that you're really again efficient with that with your time, and really hammering out routines for each section, each question is helpful for that. So you get that obviously through practicing regularly. So and then focusing on your weakness. We spoke about this earlier, but isolating that weakness is vital for growth. You don't want to cap out. Some students misidentify some weaknesses, and then self-impose limitations as to what their score can be, when it could be that it's a matter of not growing some of these subtler, smaller LSAT skills that will take you from a good LSAT student to a great one. So those are some things that I think are really helpful, and will help you, again, grow as an LSAT student.
Yeah, totally agree, Stephen. The amount of time that each person is going to need is really going to be a case-by-case thing. It all depends on where you're starting from. I would encourage one of the first things you do after you have a little bit of familiarity is to sit down and take a diagnostic test to see exactly where you're at. And then the other component would be where you're trying to get. So look at the schools you're trying to get into, see what their different LSAT entry points are at the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles. And then you can sort of figure out how many points you need to make up in that time. I think that's pretty typical, 4 to 5 months. I was about just under 6 months. But I would give yourself more time to study than you expect, especially if maybe you're working, maybe you're in school and working like I was, and you can't dedicate 30, 40 hours a week. Give yourself some time to ease into it. And that also, I think it helps you prevent you from getting burnt out if you have a longer window and then maybe slightly less hours that you're studying per week versus saying, oh, I'm going to take the LSAT in a month and I'm going to study for 50 hours a week. I think you start to see diminishing returns as your studying gets concentrated. And again, practice regularly. Make sure you're taking full-length time tests. I would make sure you have several of those, if not many, under your belt before you go in, because you can have unlimited time and be in your bedroom and in your pajamas, be all comfortable and do well. But then on test day, it's a completely different animal, and you need to be able to simulate that as close as you can. I think there's some YouTube videos or some phone apps that act as proctors, which can help simulate that process a little bit. And then, like Stephen said, don't avoid focusing on your weaknesses. Sometimes I would find myself falling into the trap of, oh, I'm really good at logical reasoning. I'm not so great at logic games. I'm going to just, hide in logical reasoning a little bit and study this a lot. You really need to be focusing on the sections that you're not as good at, or the different question types that you're not as good at, so that you can really, really nail that down. And then next slide, we have some tips to help you ace the LSAT. And this is a big one. Number one is make sure you're using official prep materials and you're using official LSAT generated questions. There are many different test prep companies that I won't name, but I can guarantee you have heard of them, that either use a mix of their own generated questions and official questions, or they don't use any official questions at all. So any resource that you're thinking about using, make sure they use official questions, because the test prep generated questions really don't go through that intensive experimental process where they get vetted by several different cohorts taking the LSAT to make sure the questions are valid before they're actually included. And LSAT provides tons of official test preps. You can buy them in sections of 10 on Amazon. I would focus on the more recent ones first. They, especially the really old ones, aren't super representative of what the test is like right now. So I would focus on those from official tests. I think it's around 30 when that starts to get more modern. And then they're probably in the 80s by now. We were only in the 70s when I took it.
I think the 90s now, actually.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe even just start at the 40s, 50s, and then you'll really get the modern LSAT experience. And then again, manage your time, come in with a plan of attack, have it in the back of your head, the average amount of time that you need to spend on each question. I think they still let you bring a watch in. I know they changed this right after I took it, because I had a customized LSAT watch that had green and yellow different sections on the face, but just have it in your head that okay, I need to be through 7 questions after 8 minutes, 9 minutes, whatever your pace is. And then that can help you keep you on track in your practice tests, so that it's just automatic on test day. And last one is just stay calm, which is a little easier said than done, especially your first time. It's going to be a little nerve-wracking, but if you take a lot of practice tests, you try to simulate test conditions as closely as you can, then it'll be as close to your practice as possible, and then you can go into it with as much ease as possible.
Yeah, definitely. I would just add to managing your time and staying calm. There's a number of different kind of strategies that you can, or practice strategies you can employ. I'm going to do the first 10 logical reasoning questions in 10 minutes, or different ways in which you can kind of get used to pacing yourself at a certain pace that you want. You need to manage your time as you kind of read through reading passages, and make sure that you're kind of acclimated and used to kind of the pace that you should be going. So on test day, you're not clock watching. I mean, you can definitely bring a watch, not a smart watch, of course, just a kind of old analog watch. And that could be helpful to glance at. But again, you don't want to be watching it. You need to be kind of focusing, obviously, on the material and the substance. And then staying calm. I think this is very important towards, obviously, your prep. I think it should be built in actively into your prep. Kind of acknowledging, different anxieties, stressors, whatever you want to call it, exist. And, to a certain extent, what you're doing on a day-to-day manner may not fully capture the amount of stress that you may feel on test day. So just making sure that you practice,
managing anxiety, because it will, creep up on you as you get closer and closer to test day. So that can be really useful in replicating more and more what some of the stress may be. I remember, when I was taking the test, the material 3 months out felt a lot more, I was a lot more relaxed with material 3 months out than I was maybe 1 month out. And it was because I was starting to kind of feel some of the stress about, the exam, but also it was an opportunity for me I realized it was an opportunity for me to kind of work under those stressful conditions. And I think it paid dividends for me because I was really stressed on test day. And that's okay. I mean, you can kind of use that stress during test day to kind of really kind of lock in and like channel all the energy you can to making sure that you're, hitting those markers where you need to be on test day.
Yeah. One other thing I would add to that is it can be helpful to like establish a routine before you take your practice tests. Like, for example, I would eat like a light, healthy snack, and I had a playlist of like 5 songs I would listen to before every single test, a practice test. So then when I did the real thing, I did the exact same thing in the car before I went in. So it put the frame in my mind that this is just another practice test. I've done this countless times before and just going to do it again.
Absolutely. I think that's some real solid advice there, Mark. Just approaching the final, real exam kind of as if it's another practice exam to, also kind of build yourself up. Like you've done this before, you've been here before. It's the same material that you've seen and, you've invested the time, but also, you're going to bring that into the exam so that you can, really optimize, the result there. So absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Those are some great tips. All right. I think we have a couple more here.
Considering a prep course, I can start this. So I think, obviously now more than ever, there's, different options online and in person. I think some key advice is really, figuring out what your learning style is and what setting really would be suitable for you. I actually did like pretty much every format in my own study, and I found different like in person, online, tutor, self-study. Like I found different settings like that to be advantageous or disadvantageous, and I really had to learn how I learned, and self-study was what I ultimately prioritize, and it worked for me. But everyone's different. So really understanding who you are as a test taker and as a learner could be helpful in that. Another tip is setting realistic goals. This one is difficult. I think you want to do this, but also you don't want to limit yourself mentally in terms of like how much you can grow. So it's like a balancing act, or kind of like, it sounds like an oxymoron, but I guess I can walk you through it. I think there's something to the notion of building slowly through a set of like realistic goals. Like, Rome wasn't built in a day. Like I spent, I think 90% of my time in the LSAT in the 150s. And then, I grew up substantially thereon, but, it was really like, months in the 150s before I, just working things out before I, jolted into, being a really great test taker, LSAT taker. So setting realistic goals, building brick by brick is really helpful. And then, one day you're going to look up and you're going to see what you built. And it could be, score that's, surpassed all expectation. I think my official test score is my highest test score ever. And I took like pretty much every practice test. So, and I had no clue that, I was capable of that, at various points. But, I think, once you let go of not necessarily like imposing, like, all I need is a 165 to get into, to be considered maybe by my dream school, like whatever it may be, like, I think not imposing that limitation, can be really powerful. And you can really surprise yourself in terms of what you can accomplish across all, LSAT score ranges. And then taking breaks, I think this is vital to studying, learning to walk away. I mean, there was some days when I was just getting beat up by the LSAT walking away and like,
relaxing. How I relaxed at the end of the day was music, video games, whatever. I took a lot of long walks. This is during the LSAT, so it was kind of a depressing time. I mean, not the LSAT. This is during COVID. Sorry. So it's kind of a depressing time. So I couldn't really like hang out with friends or anything like that. But like taking breaks away from the LSAT and stepping away from failure, like, you know, singular day failure. Like if I didn't reach my goal of getting 15 right in the section today, like again, like at the end of the day, you need to step away from that because you don't want to, you know, continue to beat yourself up over the test, because that could, you know, impact your growth long term. You want to be growth oriented. And I think taking breaks at the end of the day and throughout the day as well to remain fresh, to, you know, sort through, you know, difficult material can be a helpful mindset in practice throughout the LSAT process.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. Prep courses and tutors can be extremely helpful and can really make the difference. But the key word in this slide is reputable. Because to be honest, there are some bad programs out there and some bad tutors out there. I know Juris, I don't do LSAT tutoring myself, but I know they provide very reputable program. I know other companies do as well. But if you do decide to take a prep course, really investigate it. Make sure that it's going to get you where you want, and not because some of them are really just designed to get you into the 150s and then just leave you there with some of their strategies. And some companies are open about that. So be very careful who you sign up with. But if you find a good one, it can be extremely helpful. And then, like you said, Stephen, set realistic goals, but don't limit yourself. And this sort of ties into giving yourself enough time to prep. Because if you like plan out, say, several months in advance that you give yourself, that allows you to have more ambitious goals while still being realistic. Mm-hmm. Say, like an extreme example, you take a diagnostic test, you get like a 140, and then you say, oh, I want to get a 170 for the January administration. That's probably a bit of a stretch. I'm sure it's been done, but probably don't want to do that. But now if you say you're looking at the March administration or next July, that's probably a more realistic goal with the longer timeline. Right. And then taking breaks, take them while you're studying, but also bake in days off to your prep, which again, just goes back to give yourself a longer timeline than you think you might need. That way you can take a weekend off or 3 days off and really come back with a fresh mind.
Fantastic. Thank you both for all of that information. So open things up for a Q&A now. And I just want to reiterate, we are recording this. We will be sending this out over email in the next few days. So you'll have access to all of this information. So one question we have is, how do you anticipate the logic games being removed from the LSAT changing the scoring of it?
Yeah, I can answer that one. In a way, it's really not going to affect the scoring at all, because there will still be like the same rough amount of questions on the test. They'll be using the same scale. It's just that you will be completing additional logical reasoning questions for those points instead of logic games. So I don't think they anticipate changing the scale at this point.
Yeah, I can't say that there would be like any dramatic, one way or another impact from logic games being removed. I think it'll be a pretty even, outcome at the end of the day, I believe.
Great. And someone else is wondering if they should plan on taking the LSAT at least twice before the new format, if they've been studying with the current format.
I mean, I think it depends. I presumably from the way the question is framed, I suppose you haven't taken it already. So, I mean, it could be helpful. So like to build in like a buffer to, something could happen during a given test. I remember, there's students I've heard of who had to like run to the bathroom mid-test and, come back with like a, beating heart and, kind of, frazzled from there on. And
So stuff could happen there in the test. So it may be helpful to kind of build in a time frame if you want to capture, if you feel like logic games are, by far the strongest, test of your or section of yours, and you want to make sure that you want to capture all of those points on test day, then yeah, I would definitely prioritize making sure that you at least have maybe 2 cracks at the egg, especially this far out. It's gonna, logic games will be on the test until August 2024. So I would definitely probably take advantage of that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And the big reason why I would encourage people to think about taking it before they take them away is that for most people, they can get the biggest and quickest improvement studying logic games because you go into it very foreign and most people just do terrible with no, and this is my experience, with no experience on what they are. But compared to like logical reasoning and reading comprehension, for most people, there's always exceptions, of course. I feel like most people get more bang for their buck in their study hours studying logical games and getting that down, because you can really go from missing most to getting a perfect or a near perfect score on your logic game section just from repeating games over and over and over again in your practice, which is slightly less true for the other sections, I think. Now, some people just never really get it and are experts at logical reasoning and reading comprehension. If that's you, maybe you want to wait. But for most people, I think at least try to take it once with the logic games. And then, as Steven said, it's always good to have like a primary target test date and then with a backup that happens shortly after in case you don't get the score you want, in case you can't sit for it for whatever reason, in case you have an emergency. It's always good to just have a backup built in, regardless of removing the games.
Absolutely.
Great. We do have some questions in that are specific to individual circumstances. And for those, because we don't have all of your information and enough to go off of, I definitely recommend reaching out to our team on our website and we can give you more individualized advice and direction there. So we won't cover some of those questions. And then again, we are recording this and we'll be sending this out over email. So you'll have access to the entire webinar, start to finish, to review on your own time. Let's see. So another question we have is, what's a good amount of study? Like, what's a good study window to have? 5 or 6 months, generally what you would recommend?
Yeah, I would say, again, this all goes to like how many points you're trying to make up between where you're starting at and where your goal is. That may be only like 10 points, in which case maybe you don't need that much time, or maybe you need to make up a little bit more like I did, and then you need to set out at least a few months. I would say at least 3, longer, 4 or 5 would be better. 6 is also good, but I also think you don't want to like be studying for one LSAT administration for like a year or something, because I've seen some people do that and then they just get completely burnt out. Say like you start studying without even taking it for a year. I would not recommend that at all.
Definitely.
Great. All right. And then do you recommend taking one or multiple diagnostic tests before even starting studying, or do you recommend starting studying before kind of diving into those diagnostics?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I would recommend taking one mostly cold. Maybe come to this webinar, maybe read a little bit about it, but don't really get into the weeds. Take one, see where you're at, and then if you're like working with a good tutor or a good program, they're going to like bake in like checkpoint exams as you go along to see, like, reevaluate where you are after 3 weeks, after 2 months, 3 months, whatever. So really you only have one diagnostic you should be taking just to get a general baseline. And then you'll take many, many more prep tests if you're studying properly, but these will be less like diagnostics and more like building blocks to show how you've improved.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all solid advice. Me personally, I'm not even that big on diagnostics. I think,
a lot of
it. I mean, you don't have to take one.
Yeah, you don't have to take one. I think far more important is like the test after, practice test after, 6 weeks of study, 8 weeks of study, the tests that, that you're ramping up for the actual test day. Like, what are you capturing? What are you learning from? What are you missing in those tests? I think, as opposed to a diagnostic. But I mean, at the same time, obviously it is, helpful in terms of just like seeing, it could be helpful in terms of like, setting a runway. How much time do I need for the test, as was discussed earlier, and stuff like that. So.
Great. All right. And then another question is, would taking the test multiple times look bad on your law school applications?
I don't think so. I think now, I mean, it's pretty nuanced. Like I've heard law schools say, they really consider heavily 2 scores, and the third score is not as, impactful to them. But I've only heard, it's pretty rare of a statement from a law school. I think, past 3 tests is not something that you really want to go for. You really want to, to the extent you can, obviously everybody wants it in the first time, but the second time is fine. I took it 2-3 times. I took it, but then there was a second time, but then there was an issue with the test. It was a COVID era. So the test shut down essentially, and I had to take it like a third time, like a week later. So I was like 2 to 3 times, but, I have officially 2 scores, and, my second one was, I think 8 points higher than my first. So, they just want to see, your capacity, and they don't want you to, necessarily sit for the exam, 4 or 5 times, 6 times, because at that point you're kind of getting a strategic advantage over other students who, only get to take the test, twice, and don't necessarily get used to like, how it, anxiety ridden it maybe or not. I remember by my third time, I was a lot less, impacted by, my anxiety, because I learned how to deal with it. And, each time you take the test is really an opportunity to really observe yourself in these conditions and make adjustments. If you, don't get the score you want, and you want to take it a second time, or even a third time. But again, I wouldn't go past 3 times and having 3 official scores of the test. Mark, I don't know if you want to talk about the LSAT offers the option to cancel a score the first time. I don't know if you want me to talk about that, or you can.
Yeah, you can talk about that. I think that's a new feature.
Yeah, it's a new feature. Of course, they came out like right after, like I was the month after, like before or whatever, so I didn't get to take advantage of that. But I think LSAT offers an option on your first exam where you can have the option to see your score and then reject it if you don't like the score, for like $35 additional dollars on test day, which is a cost, but I think is a really impactful thing to do, because one thing it really does is you get to cancel the score, and LSAT law schools do see that, but it really allows you to kind of go into the first test. Hopefully you're really prepared to do so, but I guess allows you to go in the first test with a lot less stress, because at the end of the day, like push comes to shove, like a law school won't see like a really low score unless like I allow them to, or and not like invoke the provision where you can reject the score, and then you can also it's interesting because you can reject the score, and that's technically one time you take it, but I think it's still a time in which you took the test. So I think you may have to factor that into how many times you took the test at the end of the day. I know that's a long drawn answer, but I hope that covers it.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. Generally, in most cases, more than one take isn't going to hurt you unless it's an extreme situation, like you said, where you're taking the test like 6 times, and schools are just going to wonder, what are you doing? You're doing this for 2 years. It's time to move on at that point. Or if like even if like you get a lower score on a later administration, the vast majority of admissions offices explicitly state that they give the greatest weight to the highest score.
Right.
Unofficially, many don't even consider anything outside of your highest score. There are a couple of very specific examples of schools that look at more of an average, but they still, then those schools are very few and they will tell you in the process, but they still will primarily look at the highest score. So, and especially if like you increase your score, you can't hurt yourself. Like going from a 155 to say a 160, schools aren't going to look at you and say, oh, you had to take it twice to get to your 160. We don't want you. That's just not going to happen.
They'll say, oh, look at that 160.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for answering all of these questions. If we weren't able to answer your question here, or you have something that comes up later, feel free to reach out to us on our website. You can meet with our team and they can answer some of these questions. We can hook you up with a tutor. We have plenty of tutors who can help you through this whole study process, as well as counselors who can help you with your law school applications when you are ready to apply. Mark, Stephen, thank you both so much for walking us through this. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well. Keep an eye on your emails. We'll be sending out a recording of this in the next few days for you to have. And yeah, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help however we can. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.